Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. We've recently launched our Patreon page, which can be found at cynicaldeveloper.com/Patreon. If you aren't familiar with Patreon, it's an easy way for those who are interested in this show to help out by simply pledging a small amount each month in sponsorship. Now that could be as little as $5 a month, which is about £3.80, or as much as you like. You will enable us to dedicate more time creating more content to help you, including videos, more blog posts, and even more shows. So if you can, head over to cynicaldeveloper.com/Patreon and get involved. In this episode, we talked to Phillip Morgan about specialization and what it can mean to your career as a software developer. Phillip teaches self-employed software developers how to identify, validate and dominate a desirable niche market position. He's also an author of the Positioning Manual for Technical Firms. Now, this is a topic that I've struggled with for quite a while now. It's something that specialization is something that people keep telling me, I should specialize in this JavaScript framework or this technology or this part of the .NET framework and stuff like that. So I think today's conversation I'm going to get a lot out of, or I hope to get a lot out of, and I hope that you guys listening at home do as well. So welcome to The Cynical Developer, Phil.
Thank you, James. I hope you get a lot out of it too. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to what we're going to talk about today. And I suppose giving us a little bit of a background for those that aren't really sure what you mean by specialization would be a great starting point.
Sounds good. So let's back up half a step.
Sure.
And think about the typical software developer. Painting in broad strokes, I know, but the typical software developer, I think, is focused on this question. The way you phrased it earlier was, what piece of technology of this entire landscape of technology should I focus in? And I think that's the wrong question to ask. We'll say a little bit later what the right question might be. But the typical software developer is sort of overwhelmed with all the things they could know in order to develop expertise with, you name it, right? What language should I focus on? Is there a framework that's going to be that's brand new now, but it's going to be very in demand a year or two from now? Should I focus on that? All the while, the typical software developer knows if they're working for themselves, they could just stop doing that and get a job and they'd be fine. So they're sort of in the situation of, it's a sort of constraint in a way, the fact that they have so much freedom. I know that sounds strange to say, but when I think about the typical software developer, I think this is someone who, if self-employment did not work out, a job would be a pretty good backup plan. And the job that most developers could get is a pretty good earning job. So what I recommend that software developers do, and this is the long answer to your question, what is specialization? I recommend that they specialize in serving some type of business. So this advice is not going to really apply very much to someone who's a full-time employee or someone who's working for like a technology startup. But if you're independent or self-employed and a software developer, I recommend that you think about specializing in a type of business. And the fancy marketing word for that is that you focus on a market vertical. So Retail, finance, construction, manufacturing, those are all broad market verticals. They each contain, smaller sub verticals. But that's the first thing I say, and I'm not sure that developers like hearing it because it takes them away from the way you framed the question earlier, which is, what technology should I focus in? And to an extent that matters, but specialization really is most valuable when it's you focusing in the needs of a particular type of business.
Okay. So we're not looking at I'm going to become a Vue.js expert, or I'm not going to become the expert in web.mail in the .NET framework. This is actually a little bit larger than that. And for someone like myself, who I consider myself to be a full stack developer, I can design the database, I can do the back end code, I can do the front end code, I can do the design side of it. That it's not actually taking away anything from that skill set and forcing me to say, well, I'm not going to be doing any of the UI stuff. I'm not going to be doing any of the database stuff. I'm going to be just focusing in on, say, that middle layer, and that's what I specialize in. This is actually specializing in all of that, but for a particular market or market vertical, as you call it.
Yes. Now, it is possible to specialize in technology or in a particular platform or in a problem domain, and we might get to where we're talking about that during this conversation. But actually, I sort of I like to see people who have the type of diverse skills that you do, because you can solve a lot of different types of problems, and that's a good thing. But the area where you're constraining or narrowing your focus is you're saying, I want to solve a variety of problems, anything where a web app could provide value, but I'm going to focus on a particular market vertical. And the reason that I advise people to go this way is because, well, I said people, but really I mean software developers. The reason I advise them to take this approach is, and I understand this, like I was never a software developer, but I was a system administrator for years. So I have a technical background, and I know that if you feel like your identity is kind of wrapped up in how much you know about, in any aspect of software development, if I say to you, okay, you need to set that aside, and that's not really the focus anymore, you're going to feel threatened. You'll feel like I'm telling you to, go into a fight with your best arm tied behind your back is what that's going to feel like. So that's one reason why that's the recommended approach, is to focus on a market vertical. Another is because it really just gives you this built-in marketing advantage in finding clients and helping clients find out about you. And you don't really have that advantage if you say, okay, I'm going to focus just on databases or just on the front end. That really doesn't give you the same kind of marketing advantage right away that focusing on a market vertical does.
Sure. Yeah, it's I suppose sort of thinking back to it, because of the nature of the development industry, developers move around quite a lot, and I'm always questioned by friends and family of, well, what are you going to do now? What's this company that you're going to? What do they do? Is it the same as what you did before? How can you change so much? And I've always framed it that being a developer, you're taking information out of a database, you're doing something with it, manipulating it in some way and putting it back, and that's the be all and end all of it. But if you get rid of that, I guess, naive perception of or thought process about what it is we do, and you start looking at it that you want to specialize in a market, it's that business or domain knowledge, isn't it, that's going to help you and boost you in your career.
That's so. If you look at what I'm saying and what you just said, it seems like we're saying different things, but we really aren't, I think. So at one level, software development really is a universally valuable, universally applicable set of skills that can be applied to almost any kind of business at one level, because that's one thing developers are wonderful at, is thinking conceptually, thinking in the abstract. It's one of the things that I think makes someone particularly good as a developer at the level of their development skill, is they can abstract problems into concepts or sort of mental models, and then turn those into code, and it's great. So yes, at one level, software development is potentially valuable, that equally valuable in almost any application. But I do believe there's this additional layer of value that you can deliver to clients if you know something about their business. Because if let's say that even if this is even true for a full-time employee, you get hired into a new situation and you've got to spend time ramping up, right? You've got to learn the code base. And I've heard from developers examples of that taking 3 months or more, where they're really just coming up to speed on an existing code base that they're going to be working with. So as as an employee, that's just kind of figured into the cost of um, hiring that employee. The fact that they're not really going to be productive for, let's say, 3 months, for example. But when you're an independent person, you're a freelancer, you're self-employed, that ramping up time is actually a cost that you don't pay for, because you're generally passing that cost on to your client. And so if you could start to marginally reduce that cost over time. Now, the example I used before was the cost of coming up to speed on an existing code base. That cost is probably always going to be there. But what if you did not have to learn the terminology that a particular type of client uses? What if you started to understand how their business works because you've worked with other similar types of businesses? If that was true, then you would have an advantage over other developers who don't have that existing knowledge base, that domain knowledge. And that's one of the ways in which specializing in a vertical starts to create more value, or it helps you deliver more value to your clients.
Yeah, I can understand that, and I think I was coming at this from probably a wrong angle, really. And like we said, I was obviously focusing on the technology side of it, but it's a smarter move to be more focused on that business, on and what that market area is.
Here's another way to think about that that's related to what we're talking about. So obviously, as a developer, you have to have some mastery of your basic skill set. So I'm not saying that's unimportant, but one of the things that happens over time is that specific skill knowledge becomes commoditized. So, you live in Wales, I live in the U.S. By world standards, those are both relatively high cost of living areas. In other words, there are lots of places that someone could live where it's just simply cheaper to live there.
Sure.
And that puts people like us at a disadvantage because we have to charge higher rates. And all things being equal, if a company does not need someone who's local, then they've got this worldwide market of talent that they can shop to find somebody who has those skills. And so you start thinking after a while, okay, how can I be different from people who have the same skills that I do? And that's also where I think that focus on a market vertical starts to provide value. Is you can say to prospective clients, yes, you will find other people who know just as much or more than I do about JavaScript or this particular framework or what have you. But you will not find someone who has several years of experience applying that skill to manufacturing companies or retail companies or whatever. So you start to build up a competitive advantage. You start to have a reason that clients see as a compelling difference between you and somebody else who has the same skills elsewhere. So when like a JavaScript framework or Kubernetes or some kind of any aspect of technology that's brand new right now, there will be this kind of group of people who are early adopters, developers who are super curious, really eager to learn, and they're going to come up to speed on that technology first. And for several years, they'll have an advantage. They'll be able to say, yeah, I've got 2 years of experience with, the Swift programming language. Not everybody else has that, so you should hire me. But over time, that advantage evaporates because the skill becomes more widely, sort of widely diffused throughout the world of development. So that advantage of being an early adopter is just a temporary advantage. Whereas, if you have some insight into how manufacturing works and you understand, some of the algorithms that are helpful in managing inventory or doing visual image recognition in the world of manufacturing, et cetera, that becomes a real competitive advantage. And it's hard for someone else to duplicate that.
Sure. Well, we've said that this is probably not, it's not something that a employee or a permanent member of staff as a developer would probably do, but you would get that for the company that you work for. So it's more aimed at the contractor, the freelancer side of it.
It is. You do see it to a certain extent. I guess I need to qualify what I said earlier. To a certain extent, you will see employees who have specialized knowledge go to other companies where that specialized knowledge is needed. So if someone was working at Google, for example, in their self-driving car project, then there's a couple other companies that would be very eager to hire away that person because of that specialized knowledge. So to an extent, you see that happen in the world of full-time employment. But on the other hand, most employers are doing everything they can to make their employees 100% interchangeable. And that's why you don't see this as much in the world of FTE jobs, is that they really want their people to be interchangeable so they can be replaced if they leave or something happens. So this really is a concept that's much more applicable to the world of self-employment.
Sure. So to sort of spin that on its head from being a positive thing, are you not painting yourself into a corner by specialising? So where I'm based, there's a couple of medical related companies. So if you specialised in software for drug licensing, for example, I could work for one of two companies in the area. But if I've worked for one of those and then the other company has a policy that they don't hire anybody that worked for company A for whatever silly reason, I guess I've got to be prepared to move as well my location to be able to continue in that specialization.
I want everybody who's listening to really hear what I'm saying. You 100% are painting yourself into a corner when you do this. But if the corner is sufficiently large and there's a lot of money and opportunity there, you'll be happy that you did it. So, James, you named an example that I think is a really great example. You would not want to specialize in the way you described.
Right, okay.
Because it would be in a type of company, but the amount of opportunity that's there that's accessible to you is just too small. And so you've brought up what's one of the biggest sort of criteria at the early part of this process that you need to look at, which is there sufficient opportunity in the market? At the same time, you're also asking, is the market small enough that I can quickly develop a reputation and become known within this market? So, to use the analogy of the fish in the pond, it's like it's easier to make the pond smaller than it is to make the fish bigger. And being a big fish in a small pond is, usually considered desirable. But if the pond is too small, the fish won't live for very long. You put your finger on a very important point, which is that the size of the market needs to be about the right size. And that's something you should definitely consider. So you can't just sometimes I joke that randomly choosing a specialization would work out better for most people than making no choice at all, because specialists can charge higher rates, and over the course of your career, it's likely to work very much in your favor to specialize. And I joke about that, just make a random choice, but I don't really mean that, because you do want to, You do want to make sure that the
Yeah.
market you're looking at is big enough and not too big and so forth. So absolutely. The flip side of making a bad choice is, the flip side of this is if you made a bad choice, you're in a worse situation, but you can always change your mind. You can always, reverse that choice. You're not getting a tattoo on your face.
Yeah.
This is a reversible decision.
Sure, sure. So if somebody wanted to specialize in a certain area, what things should they do? If they wanted to specialize in accountancy software, do they need to go and have a look at some of the accountancy qualifications and learn about that? How do they get that specialized knowledge?
I think I can boil this down into a 3-step process. And the reason I think I can is because I already have. I wrote a very short book called Specializing Without Failure recently. And that's the approach I took in with this book, which is looking at the, hundreds of people that I've worked with in some capacity on this process of moving from generalist to specialist, and identified the patterns across all of those people. And there's I think there's a sequence you need to do it in.
Right.
And it gets back to something I said earlier. So as a software developer, you're in this really wonderful, privileged position. Right now, businesses value what you do a lot more than they value someone who does data entry or answers phones. Yep. Or whatever, right? At the same time, you require very little in the way of certification or licensing or formal training. You can learn all this stuff on the internet on your own and all of a sudden have this really great paying job. So the reason I say that is if a software developer came to me and said, I would like to specialize, tell me what to do. And if I then said, well, just pick the most profitable market and focus on that. And then the most profitable market turned out to be something they absolutely hate. They're not going to stick with it.
Sure.
And I don't blame them. I wouldn't either. This is very personal. This is what we spend our time doing. We want to enjoy it. So the first step is to pick a market vertical that is interesting to you, that does not conflict with your values, and it's something you could find interesting. Here in the U.S., there's a list of market verticals called the NAICS table. If you just Google for NAICS, I think you'll almost certainly find the website I'm talking about.
Right.
And it has a list of market verticals. Again, it's things like retail, manufacturing, healthcare, et cetera. So just go through that list and pick out a few that are at least neutral or interesting to you, and exclude anything that is not interesting to you. That's the first step. It's better if you have some amount of access, if you have contacts there. Some people it matters. They're only going to work with local companies. Others can work remotely with companies anywhere in the world where they share a common language.
Yeah.
So those are all factors, but really the first big factor is, are you interested in this market vertical? And if so, then you can move on to the next, which is, do you have any credibility there? Can you credibly say, oh yeah, I've got some experience working with this type of company? If you don't, I think you can build that up over time, but it may not be something you can immediately have access to. And then the third factor is, does this market need what you sell? Not every market vertical is going to have a need for custom software.
Sure.
I mean, I should revise that. Not every company within every market vertical is going to need custom software. Some will, some won't. So do they value what you do is really the third big criteria.
Yeah.
So it's interest, credibility, and then the market's demand for what you do. If all those things look good, then you've got at least one good candidate for how you might specialize.
Yeah, because I guess you can fall back onto your experience if you have it as a permanent employee. As examples, I've worked for holiday companies, I've worked for logistics companies, building custom software as a permanent employee for those sort of companies. And I guess that would be an advantage, that if I picked one of those sectors, I could say, oh, well, I've done this in the past, this is what I built, and that's your credibility factor to say that you've done something in that industry.
And think about it from the perspective of the company that's looking to hire an independent software developer to help them with something. Most of them have never run across a software developer who is specialized in some way, other than specializing in technology or some aspect of technology.
Yeah.
So you really stand out when you meet with this prospect and say, we're actually pretty excited about working with companies like yours. We've specialized, in fact, in working with companies like yours. And they might say, well, why did you do that? And you have some story, not a made up, false story, but you have some reason why. Like, oh, I have an uncle who worked in logistics, or previously I worked in logistics at my last full-time job, and I think it's actually a very interesting industry. And
yeah,
I love writing software because we solve really valuable problems for you guys, and that's why we focused on logistics companies.
Sure.
And from their perspective, they feel like they've found, a diamond. It's just something very valuable, because the specialization of this type is quite rare. I think it's unfortunate, but it's fairly rare. In the field of medicine, about 70% of doctors are specialized in some way. In the field of accounting, about 30% are specialized in some way. I don't have a lot of data about software development, but I think it's closer to about 5% are specialized in some way.
Yeah. I think everybody is a little bit of a generalist. I don't think I've ever met or knowingly met a developer that says, "Oh, I only build software for X industry." It's a very new and different twist on actually thinking about the sphere of development.
Yeah, it is. It is, and I think that's not a reason to do. I mean, everything is kind of always new in software development.
Yeah.
But at the same time, software development as a profession is relatively new when you compare it to medicine and accounting and law and other more established professions. That's part of the reasons why I think there's very little by way of certification or licensing that's required. I'm not the one who came up with this idea. A guy named David C. Baker wrote this in a book he published recently. But he said maybe the reason that licensing is not required is because the government doesn't believe that software developers can really do that much damage. Yeah. And I think I love developers, but I think there's evidence to the contrary that software can cause a lot of damage. It's just that, the government hasn't really caught up with that idea yet.
Yeah, definitely. And I know when I told my parents and my my head of year in school that I wasn't going to complete my A levels, I was going to go to college and I was going to do a course in computing and go into software development, that they laughed at me and told me that it'd be a flash in the pan, that it's all a fad. My parents were a little bit less like that, but more from the head of year. He told me that computers wouldn't last. It was just the fad phase that everybody was going through, and there's never going to be a career in writing software and doing anything with computers. I think
what an amazing blunder that person made.
Yeah. And I remember going home that night angry with him and angry with the parents to a degree, and thinking, do you know what? I'm going to show you all that you are so wrong.
Yeah, no, it's they were wrong for sure.
Yeah, and I think the advantages that you talked about specializing is something I've experienced a little bit in the past, because in a past life I was a graphic designer, so I've got that artistic flair as well as being able to to write the software for the systems, and that's a very rare combination. Normally, you're a coder or you're a designer or an artist or whatever. Very rarely you get the two, and that's been in some places when I've worked for creative agencies and stuff like that. That's been working in my benefit because I understand the specialization that they work in on a much broader scale than just a software developer or programmer.
Right.
So,
right. Right. Part of it is, I suspect, with you having that background, you have a sort of a sympathetic feeling towards designers. Like, you understand what's difficult about their craft, and maybe, with the designer working with you being doing the development part and them doing the design, that collaboration might be more effective.
Yeah.
Because this is not true of all developers, but oftentimes developers just kind of look at designers and think, what is wrong with you? Why do you see the world that way? Like, why do you care if it's 1 pixel off?
Yeah.
Why does that matter? And you probably are more sympathetic when it comes to interacting with designers because you've seen both sides. And so really, I'm just using that to make my point, which is that when you learn about a business, you start to develop that kind of sympathetic, empathetic relationship with those types of businesses. And that also creates value for the client because they're working with someone who is actively trying to understand their world. And that stuff matters in the software project. It makes better software when you care about that stuff. I think you can argue. I mean, it doesn't replace having a fundamental level of competence. It doesn't make bad code go away, but
no.
I think it makes better software if the developer is really empathetic with their client and understands their client's world a bit.
Yeah, and I think understanding as you put it, understanding the client's world a little bit better means that you can take that problem and convert it into code a lot easier, because as you did say earlier, we take a lot of problems as developers and we take bits away from them, we abstract them until they become that abstract problem. We find the solution for the abstract problem and then try and fit that around the real world problem, which can sometimes be a little bit difficult, especially when it comes to the likes of terminology. But if you've got that understanding of that problem market, it makes that transition easier, and you can also explain why you can or can't do something in a certain way to your client in a way that they'll understand, rather than, well, it's not possible because this type is immutable, which means that we can't do this and we can't do that, and then because we can't turn this information into this information, and the client that you saw into, their head's going to be spinning. They're not going to know what you're on about. But if you can break it down into their terms as to why they can't do it, then I guess you are onto a winner there.
Yeah, it's an advantage. And we've talked about a number of advantages that specialization helps you cultivate. None of them on their own are all that impressive, but what you're doing is harnessing multiple small advantages. There's a communication advantage. There's a marketing advantage. When people leave one company and go to another, it's likely that the other company they go to will be in the same industry.
Yeah.
They have contacts there, whatever. So people kind of move around within market verticals primarily. So, there's a marketing advantage. Word of mouth kind of spreads organically because your contact at one company from a previous project, if they change jobs, they may take you to another company because they like working with you. So you're harnessing all these multiple advantages.
Sure.
And again, just on their own, each one of them seems kind of small, but altogether they become quite powerful, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the conversation has gone a little bit in a different direction to what I expected to go into, and I think it's opened my eyes a little bit to something very different. It really has. I've not really sat down and thought about specialization in this way before, so it's definitely been very interesting.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I apologize if I was trying a little too hard to convince you, but I really am bought into the idea. I think.
Yeah. Well, this is exactly what the podcast's about. I'm the cynical developer. I've got to try and get out of you guys that come on as guests why I need to use your technology or do things the way that you say they should be done. And this has definitely given me something to think about, and hopefully it's given the listeners something to think about as well.
Wonderful.
Awesome. So I'll thank you again for coming on and spreading your knowledge on this topic with myself and sharing it with the listeners as well. It's been an interesting half an hour.
Wonderful. I was really happy to get the chance to speak with you, James.
Yeah, it's been good, and we'll get some links in the show notes to your books and things like that, and to your website, so that if anybody out there wants to talk to you a little bit more, maybe in a private forum type of way, then they can actually get in contact with you and talk to you a little bit more about specialization. So thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
Thanks, and thank you to the listeners. You've been listening to The Cynical Developer. I'm James Stoddart, and you've been listening to Phillip Morgan talking about specialization for developers. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website, where you can find all the resource links, show notes for each episode. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and help The Cynical Developer to reach more developers around the globe.